So my name is Jadna Davies. I'm a mother of three and I've worked at the Women's Resource Centre working on the Murray strategy, which looked at prevention, diagnosis and support for families impacted by fetal alcohol spectrum disorders and early life trauma. Growing up in Fitzroy, I questioned as a child things that were going on, the domestic violence and the alcohol abuse, and I wondered why those things were happening. Our study, the FASD study, we have the highest rates in the world, but it's also the first population-based study in the world. So the first study where a community has said, you know, we have a problem and let's look at it and let's look at the numbers. And when I learnt about trauma and the effects on the brain, you can see why we have really high rates of FASD. I can see that this has been a result of trauma that's just been passed down. The brain in pregnancy is developing from day one right through. Like the brain doesn't finish developing until we're in our early 20s. So when you look at a child with FASD, the brain has been affected, and the most important part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, that's responsible for our executive functioning, the ability to see something, follow it through, that function isn't there. But I've also learned how trauma and alcohol affect those connections from happening. So if a child is exposed to trauma all the time or is living in a traumatic environment, their body will produce adrenaline, which then gets pumped to the brain, which tells our brain to produce cortisol, which makes our heart pump fast. And when I started to learn about all those things, it explains some of the behaviours you see in your own community. There's a part in the brain called the amygdala that tells our brain whether we are safe or not. And this part is affected if a child is living in a stressful environment, because that part becomes overactive, constantly sending signals to the brain that you're not safe, making this child more prone to have outbursts. When they're in that fight, flight and freeze, they can't access their prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for their decision making and their high thinking and their executive functioning. So you can see why people do these things and you wonder, how could they have done that? What were they thinking? Well, the truth is they weren't thinking. Their brain had literally shut off the part of their brain that thinks. It just shut it off. I think that drives my passion to want to find supports for family impacted by FASD and trauma, but also to educate people coming into our community so that our next generation is going to be a different trajectory for them. Why do we have the highest rates of FASD in the world? Why don't our children graduate schooling? Why aren't our children going off to university? You look at trauma and intergenerational trauma, you look at epigenetics and how it's changing our DNA. Well, that's the reason. But we can change that. The brain has plasticity, it can change, and we can grow parts of our brain, we can retrain our brain. Someone has to do this work, and it's hard work, it's emotional work. It pulls on the heartstrings every day, but when you see a family get the help that they need and just see the change in them, that's what we're here for. That's why we come here every day.